The people remained silent and left, and thus ended the council's billion-year rule. The council chamber had no doors or windows. Only light, cold, lifeless, as if born not of the stars but of the very void between them. It poured from everywhere and from nowhere, flowing around thousands of chairs rising in tiers all the way to the dome, where the silhouettes of beings whose names no earthly language could pronounce could be discerned in the darkness. 1 billion years. That's how long this hall has existed. That's how long the council has decided who should live and who should serve. Legend said the first council met back when there were only 8 intelligent species in the universe, and the Milky Way hadn't yet received its name. Since then, races have changed, stars have faded, entire civilizations have been born and died, but the council has remained. It has seen the birth of thousands of empires and their fall. It has seen species arrive at its doorstep, proud, warlike, confident in their right to exist, and depart broken, submissive, and silent. Because the council had a weapon more terrible than any fleet. Field of Subordination. No one knew exactly how it worked, whether it was psionics, ancient technology woven into the very architecture of the hall, or something else entirely, something no science had ever come up with a name for. But when a delegate entered that hall, something within them shifted. Will slipped away like sand through fingers. Pride turned to dust. The mind remained clear, that was the cruelest thing, but the body, the voice, the very will to resist vanished, as if they had been cut away with a scalpel. Over 1 billion years, thousands of species have passed through this hall. And each one, every single one, at some point fell silent, lowered their heads, and uttered words of submission. Some fell to their knees. Some wept. There were races with 4 hearts and steely skin, races that conquered supernovas with engineering genius, races whose warriors could stop a tank with their bare hands, and all of them, standing before this light, became quiet, obedient children. It has always been this way. Until this day. Captain Elena Voronova stood in the small shuttlecraft, looking at the approaching council station, a colossal structure like a tangle of bones and light, orbiting an artificial star that the hall's creators had once lit simply because they could. Beside her, Mark Kim, the mission's translator, stood silent, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You're afraid," she said, not as a question. "And you don't?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with that special kind of terror that comes not from danger, but from the unknown. "Elena, we're talking about beings who have seen galaxies die. They've been here longer than our species has existed. What can we even tell them?" Elena didn't answer right away. She stared out the window at the slowly rotating station, at this unimaginable monument to power, and something inside her, not fear, but something close to it, was tightening into a tight knot. 3 months ago, humanity encountered its first intelligent species outside the solar system. A race calling itself the Cress, traders and brokers who had traveled halfway across the galaxy. Their first words to humanity weren't a greeting. They were a warning. "You will be summoned to the council," their ambassador said, and there was something akin to pity in his eyes, dark, multifaceted, like an insect's. "This is how it is with any new species. Don't resist. Simply accept what you are told. That's what everyone does. That's how they survive." Since then, humanity has lived in tense anticipation, knowing that somewhere out there, in the depths of space, ancient beings are deciding its fate. And now the challenge has arrived. Official. Uncontested. Show up. Or be destroyed. The hall greeted them with a silence that seemed almost alive. Elena and Mark walked along a long bridge of dark, light-absorbing material, while around them, tier after tier, thousands of creatures rose, representatives of species humanity had never even suspected. Some were enormous, armored beings, like walking mountains. Others were slender, translucent figures, floating in the air without any visible support. Still others had no form at all, merely a swirling mist of light within protective fields. And they all remained silent. Silent and watching. In the center of the hall, on a raised platform, hovered a sphere, not a mechanism, not a creature, but something in between, so ancient that the very question, "What is it?" seemed inappropriate. The voice emanating from it spoke in every language in the galaxy, including English, perfect, without the slightest accent, as if someone had implanted it directly into their consciousness. The species calling itself humanity. You have been summoned for assessment. As have all species before you. Beside Elena, Mark took a shuddering breath. She felt something elusive begin to change in the air, as if the pressure were increasing, even though the instruments were silent. As if the light itself was growing heavier. The assessment is simple. The sphere's voice continued. You will state your place in the universe. The Council will decide whether you are worthy of autonomy, or whether your species, like most others, will serve the galaxy in another capacity. In a different capacity. Elena had heard this from Cress. A euphemism for slavery. The transformation of an entire civilization into a labor force, a resource, biological material for someone else's needs. Begin, the sphere said. And then Elena felt it. The pressure didn't come from outside, it seemed to originate within her own skull. Not pain. Not a physical sensation at all. Rather, it was a quiet, insinuating voice, sounding from the very depths of her consciousness, whispering something that wasn't her thoughts, but seemed absolutely, undeniably true. You are small. You are weak. Your appearance is nothing compared to what witnessed the birth of stars. Kneel down. Accept it. It will be easier. The voice wasn't loud. It was almost gentle, like a lullaby a mother sings to her child to make it stop crying and fall asleep. And in this tenderness lay all his strength. He didn't break through pain. He convinced through affection. Through a quiet, irrefutable confidence in his own rightness. Elena felt her knees weaken. She saw out of the corner of her eye that Mark was already swaying next to her, his lips trembling, his eyes glassy, as if he were looking not at the room but through it, into some inner abyss. He was ready to speak. She knew that look, the look people have before saying something they'll regret for the rest of their lives. And then something happened that no one in this hall expected. Not the beings on the tiers. Not the sphere in the center. Not the Council itself, remembering a billion years of uninterrupted victories. Elena silently reached out and squeezed Mark's wrist. Not a word. Not a gesture of resistance worthy of a ballad. Just the hand of one frightened man clinging to another. Just a reminder, you are not alone. And this was enough for something, fragile, thin, but real, to stay on the edge. Mark blinked. Once, twice. The voice in his head didn't disappear, but he seemed to take a half step back, as if he'd stumbled upon something he hadn't expected. The sphere above the elevation swayed slightly, barely noticeably, but an experienced observer would have detected something akin to surprise in this movement. Speak, she repeated, and this time there was something new in her intonation. Impatience. Elena raised her head. The voice within her continued to whisper about the smallness of humanity, about the inevitability of subjugation, about a billion years of history that could not be challenged by one weak species from one small planet. It flowed like cold water, filling every crevice of her consciousness, searching for something to cling to. But Elena Voronova had something that the Field of Subjugation could not foresee, because it had never encountered it before. The stubbornness of a biological species that has survived against all odds for 200,000 years. People have buried entire eras of catastrophe, glaciers, volcanoes, plagues, wars that wiped cities from the face of the earth, and each time, instead of submitting, they rose again. Not because they were stronger than fate, but because they simply didn't know when to stop and admit defeat. This wasn't a virtue. It was practically a defect in their nature. But it was precisely this defect that kept Elena on her feet now. She didn't say a word. She simply closed her mouth. Tightly. Demonstratively. And remained standing. This was not what the council expected. For 1 billion years, proud warriors, philosopher emperors, a hive mind capable of processing 1 trillion thoughts per second, passed through this field. And all of them, faced with this pressure, tried to fight it with words, to argue, to persuade, to prove their worth. And it was precisely this attempt to speak, this attempt to formulate resistance in words, that became their weakness. Because the field didn't fight the force of argument. It penetrated the very structure of speech, the very attempt to express dissent, and transformed this attempt into capitulation. The more a species tried to explain why it shouldn't submit, the deeper it sank into the logic of submission. It was a trap disguised as dialogue. And people just fell silent. Mark, still trembling but now recovered from Elena's touch, also clenched his jaw. He looked at her, and she shook her head slightly. Shut up. Just shut up. The seconds dragged on like drops of resin. The audience watched, thousands of eyes, compound, slit-like, lidless, all staring at the two tiny creatures standing in the middle of an impossible space, not saying a word. You are invited to speak, the sphere said, and this time there was something in its voice that shouldn't have been there. Confusion. Elena remained silent. The voice inside her head grew tense, more insistent, as if it sensed its grip was losing its hold. It was no longer a gentle lullaby. It now carried notes of alarm, almost panic, characteristic of a being confronted with something incomprehensible for the first time in a long, long time. It painted before her mind's eye images of ruined cities, dead loved ones, all the horror that would befall her kind if she didn't speak, didn't explain herself, didn't begin this process of submission with words. She remained silent. Because intuitively, somewhere on a level deeper than consciousness, she understood the main thing. This creature, this system, this. She said only one word, quietly, evenly, looking straight into the light of the sphere. No. The hall shook. Not physically, though the instruments on Mark's belt detected a microscopic surge in some kind of energy field, something no earthly instrument had ever detected before. The very space around the field of subjugation shook, as if the system, which had been functioning flawlessly for 1 billion years, was encountering a command it couldn't process for the first time. Because the field was created to break willpower through dialogue. It wove itself into the very structure of the response, into the very attempt of a rational being to explain, to argue, to reach an agreement. It was the perfect predator for beings who believed that words could solve everything. But no, without an explanation, without a plea, without fear hidden in the subtext, was not the answer. It was a closed door. The sphere's voice momentarily vanished entirely. The silence in the hall became absolute, palpable, as if the very air held its breath. The creatures on the tiers, representatives of hundreds of species, submissive for 1 billion years, silent in their submission, stared at the two humans with wide-open eyes, for those who had them. And then the sphere flared brighter, and the voice returned, but now it sounded different. It carried a tension, a confusion of the highest order, as if an ancient mind, accustomed to absolute power, for the first time in countless eons felt beneath its feet not solid ground, but emptiness. Are you refusing dialogue? We refuse to explain why we deserve to exist, Elena said quietly, her voice, despite all the whispering in her head, not trembling. We already exist. That's enough. Beside her, Mark clenched his fists, and this time the voice in his head, trying to whisper words of submission, was completely drowned out by its own emptiness. Because there was nothing to grasp at. There was no request, no argument, no weakness to cling to. People just stood there. And were silent. And that was enough. What happened next stretched out over several minutes. But to the beings watching from their chairs, those minutes seemed like an eternity compressed into one long, impossible moment. The field of subjugation, which had functioned reliably for 1 billion years, was built on one fundamental principle: a sentient being, faced with superior force, seeks to negotiate, to explain, to find a compromise. This was ingrained in the very nature of communication among every species known to the galaxy. Even the proudest, most warlike races appearing before the Council eventually began to speak, because silence in the face of fate seemed unnatural, impossible, a suicidal act. No one has ever tried to just shut up before. No one thought it possible to stand before absolute power, to feel its icy presence within one's own skull, and simply to say nothing. No plea. No threat. No philosophy. Only silence, thick as stone, and one short word, dropped into the void, like a stone into stagnant water. The sphere above the dais began to flicker unevenly, as if the system that had sustained it for 1 billion years had encountered a logical loop with no solution for the first time. The voice emanating from it disintegrated into fragments of phrases, ancient languages, forgotten formulas of power, commands that had never before been spoken because they had never before been needed. This is unacceptable. The assessment requires an answer. You won't have it, Elena said. And then she fell silent again. On the tiers, something began that this hall had never seen in its entire unimaginable history. Elder Troll, he who remembers the sky before chains, rose from his seat. Slowly, heavily, as if his bones had grown numb from 10,000 years of motionless obedience. His massive figure towered over the rest of his kind, who stood frozen in stupor nearby, disbelieving their own senses. He too was silent. But his silence was different. It was an echo of what had happened on the bridge below. The first crack in the wall his people believed to be eternal. Other races stirred nearby. Translucent beings, floating without support, began to slowly, synchronously lower their energy fields, a gesture that in their language signified not submission, but something quite the opposite: readiness for action. The misty creatures within their protective field shimmered more intensely, as if a fire had been igniting within them, smoldering for millennia beneath the ashes of submission. The hall was filled not with sound, but with its absence, the heavy, thick, electrified silence of thousands of beings who, for the first time in 1 billion years, sensed that an alternative existed. The sphere trembled ever more violently. Its light dimmed in fits and starts, as if the very architecture of the chamber, the very ancient device that had sustained the Field of Subjugation for so many eons, were beginning to crack under the weight of something it was never designed to withstand: silence unfilled by fear. Because the entire mechanism of the Council's power was built on one simple principle, one that no one had ever dared to test before. A power that rules through words is powerless against one who refuses to speak. The sphere's voice became almost pleading, that unthinkable, impossible transformation that no creature in this hall could have imagined an hour ago. Answer. Please. The assessment cannot be completed without dialogue. The system requires. Elena looked at Mark. He nodded, barely noticeable, but firmly. The fear in his eyes hadn't gone away. It was still there, deep, animalistic, natural to a creature facing a force capable of erasing its species from the face of the galaxy with a single word. But beyond the fear lay something else now. Determination. That same stubborn, illogical, almost reckless human trait that drove their ancestors to venture out into the open sea, unaware of what lay beyond the horizon. To rise into the sky on fragile machines made of fabric and wood, to fly to the stars, without any certainty of returning. They turned. Simultaneously. Without a word. And they went back across the bridge, to where they came from. That moment, the moment when two people turned their backs on the sphere of power that had ruled the galaxy for 1 billion years and walked away in silence, later became known in the thousands of languages of the galaxy under different names. On Tral, it was called the Day of the Cracked Sky. Among the translucent wanderers, it was called the Hour of the First Silence. And when humans learned the whole story, they called it simply, the Departure. because that is what destroyed what seemed indestructible for a billion years. Not weapons. Not an army. Not a cunning strategy, or a brilliant speech that undermines the logic of ancient power. Simply a refusal. A simple, quiet, inexplicable decision for a system built on dialogue, not to participate. The sphere behind them flared one last time, brighter than before, as if trying to hold its subjects with the same force it had been using for a billion years without fail. The pressure in Elena and Mark's heads grew almost unbearable. Voice, whispers, images of catastrophe, promises of pain crashed down on them with renewed fury, like a drowning man's last, desperate attempt to grasp at a straw. But they had nothing to cling to, because people no longer gave answers that could be turned against them. They simply walked, step by step, across the bridge, through the silence, through the millennia-old illusion of absolute power crumbling around them. Behind them, on the tiers, what would later be called the beginning of the end was happening. The Thrall rose from their seats one by one, entire ranks, entire generations, frozen in a stupor of submission for so long they had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. The translucent wanderers coiled their energy fields into taut, ready clots. The misty beings flared brighter, converging more tightly around some invisible yet unmistakable flame, a flame called determination. Neither of them said a word, because they finally understood the main secret that two small, fragile, incredibly stubborn creatures had just revealed to the entire galaxy without a single unnecessary phrase. Silence is not defeat. Sometimes silence is the only language true freedom speaks. The sphere faded. Slowly, in fits and starts, like a dying star whose light still reaches observers long after the star itself is gone. The voice that had echoed within it for a billion years spoke its final words, quiet, almost plaintive, addressed no longer to the people leaving the hall, but into the void, where absolute, unquestionable power once resided. This shouldn't have ended like this. But everything ends. Even what seems eternal. Especially what rests not on true strength, but on the fear of those who have never dared to test whether that fear has a bottom. Elena and Mark left the hall, climbed onto their shuttle, and when the doors closed behind them, she finally allowed herself to tremble violently, with her whole body, like a person trembling who has just experienced something that he himself did not fully understand at the moment when it happened. Mark whispered, still pale, still in disbelief. Did we do it? Elena looked out the porthole, where the Council station, which had been orbiting an artificial star for a billion years, was beginning to flicker with an uneven, dying light for the first time, and there, on the far tiers, she could see flashes of what could only be one thing, an uprising that had begun in complete, absolute silence. No, she answered quietly. We just stopped speaking to them in their language. The ship pulled away smoothly from the station, carrying the two people back to their small, inconspicuous planet on the outskirts of the galaxy, a planet that, without realizing it, had just shown the entire universe, for the first time in a billion years, that the most ancient, the most absolute power collapses not from rebellion, not from war, not from weapons. It collapses when those it rules simply stop responding to it. Epilogue. Months passed. The Council station, the very one that had hung in the void for a billion years, a silent judge over the fates of 1,000 species, no longer shone with its cold light. The sphere went dark completely 3 days after the departure. It simply stopped functioning, as if the heart had been removed from a body that had long forgotten what it felt like to beat on its own. The Thrall were the first to declare their independence. Behind them came translucent wanderers, misty beings, dozens of species whose names humanity was only just beginning to learn. There was no war. No vengeance. There was only a quiet, pervasive awareness. The chains that seemed eternal were held not by force, but by the belief that they could not be broken. Cress, the traitors who first alerted humans, sent a short message to Earth. It contained one sentence, translated into dozens of languages. You didn't know the rules. That's why you were able to break them. Elena Voronova no longer flew to the stars as a military captain. Her name became known in systems whose existence humanity hadn't even suspected a year ago, not as a hero, but as the name of someone who simply didn't respond when everyone expected one. And in the old, empty council chamber, amid the dead light of the extinguished sphere, silence hung for a long time. The same silence that had once been a weapon for some, and had become freedom for all others. Curtain.